influential thinkers that we have that were Greek were not in Greece. There is a date, we're talking around the 1400s, we're talking about the time of the Trojan War. There was an invasion. I don't know if anyone is aware of that invasion in Greece. It's an important date. It's an important event in Greek history. It's called the Dorian invasion. And during the Dorian invasion, the Mycenaean Empire crumbles, and many of the Greeks spread throughout Athens. But not just in Athens, they spread to Ionia, which is modern-day Turkey, and they also spread to southern Italy, today Sicily. The Greeks spread there. So when we say Italy and when we say Ionia or Asia, we still mean Greeks. It's the Greeks that spread out into those areas. Now, I talked about two ways of discovering truth, or two paths to discovering truth. And the two paths was, we have on one end empiricism. We have empiricism. On the other, you have rationalism. And no one understands that these paths are really paths to walking through to discover what is truth. Now, before we came to the age of empiricism and rationalism, where did we get our truth from? How did we understand life back before the time of the philosophers, the thinkers? Where did we get truth from? We got the idea of truth from our myths. It's from these myths that we came to understand what is true. How did the world come to be? And why is it that the wind is raging? Why is there thunder and lightning? And back then they'll say Zeus is responsible for the lightning. They'll say, oh, the sun is shining because of Apollo. And they'll say that the sea was the sea god, or the war, the god of the war. They explained these natural phenomena based on the gods. Well, the Greeks came to a place where they paused for a moment and they began to look at the behaviors of the gods. And when they looked at the behaviors of the gods, they said, these gods are lustful. These gods are murderers. These gods are thieves and they're liars. And many of these Greek thinkers said, they didn't create us. So, matter of fact, we created them. And so they stopped looking to the gods to look for truth, and they began to look where? Where do you begin? If you remove the gods, where do you begin? How do you begin to even think about where you and I came from? Where did life come from? How did the world come to be now that you've removed the gods? And these Greeks who first challenged the idea of the gods, they used empiricism. The very first thinkers, as we were moving from the mythos period to the logos period, or the time of reason, they moved to a period where they decided that they were going to look into nature. They were going to start in nature to find out truth. And they all came to this conclusion that it was from one element in nature that all things came. Thales said it was water. Anaximenes said it was air. Heraclides said it was fire. Does that sound familiar? These are the natural elements of the world. And they believe that from one of these elements, the world came to be. They said that there's a lot of movement and all sorts of, and so they looked into nature and they discussed what is truth based on the senses. If I can see it, must be true. If I can hear it, must be true. If I can taste it, if I can touch it, like our senses became the highest level for determining truth. And so you had the Ionians on this side, and when we think about the Ionians, we think of guys like Thales. We think of guys like Heraclides. Right? When we think of guys like Heraclides, Thales, these are the guys that said we can discover truth based on our ability to be able to see it, hear it, touch it, feel it. And they said that it's from their senses, empiricism, that they know that this thing is true. Until on the other end, you had some other thinkers that came and they challenged that view. The thinkers that were on the other end, they said, no, it's not in nature that we begin. We actually have to look at things like the abstract. Right? They started talking about things that are beyond the physical called the metaphysical. And so the rationalists, they challenged the empiricists. The empiricists were saying truth can only be discovered by things that you can verify from your senses. And they said, if I can't see it, if I can't taste it, if I can't touch it, if I can't hear it, it's not true. And then the rationalists in Italy, one like Pythagoras, said, then what do we do with numbers? Who in here has ever seen a number?
And also prove to me that you have a brain.
Yes. Well, that's true. They'll argue that we could actually scan a person and then, do some things that they did in the 1800s, which they went to the graves and pulled out the bodies so that they could study what the human body was like. But yes, these rationalists, they began to challenge them, and they said, well, there's no such thing as actually movement and motion. Everything is in the mind, because the mind actually tells you what you're actually experiencing. And so they said it's not about your senses, it's about intuition, it's about our ability to reason. And one of these guys, his name was Zeno, and he would say, he would do his paradoxes. He says, if you were to run 100 meters, wouldn't it be true that you needed to run past 50 meters first?
I needed not, Tank.
Right? You got to cross 50. And if you cross 50, isn't it true that you need to cross 25? And if you cross 25, isn't it true that you need to cross 12.5? And then 12.5, 6, 3, all the way down to the smallest space. And you realize that the smallest space is indivisible. And then Zeno says, well, we never moved. How do you know you're not a butterfly dreaming that you're a human sitting right where you are right now? I did this with some students, and they said, Pastor, stop, this is enough. Oh. And I said, the only thing that's telling you that you're here is your senses, but your senses can be wrong sometimes. Maybe you ate something, and all of a sudden your senses are out the window. What if there's a sixth sense that we don't know about? And so there was this battle between the Italians and the Ionians over what's true. And you got a guy by the name of Parmenides here. And he was like saying that there's no such thing as motion. Everything is in the mind. Now, I want you to understand something. This doesn't change throughout history. Rationalism and empiricism will battle throughout history up until the time of Immanuel Kant. Now, when we pause for a second to look at what happened here, they battled for so long that they created a type of skepticism. And no one understands that skepticism is always the fruit of 2 or 3 or more ideas clashing, and no one knows what the truth is. And when no one knows what the truth is, they begin to say, well, can anyone know the truth? Well, can the truth ever be known? And they begin to challenge your thinking by saying, there's no such thing as asking for the meaning of life. That's not important anymore. Skepticism would say it's about asking the simple things in life. One of the most simple things in life, instead of asking the question, what is the meaning of life, is asking the question, how can I be happy? I just want to be happy. I don't care about the meaning of life. I just care about being happy. And so skepticism kind of creates those sorts of moments where two sides or three or more sides don't get it right. And the person that would come and create like a synthesis or bring the two together is a guy by the name of Plato. That's why Plato became so important, because he's known as the great synthesizer. He's the great synthesizer because Plato said both sides are important. If I was to put a number on it, Plato would say, but it's 75% rationalism and 25% empiricism. Now, to kind of capture Plato's ideas, he tells a parable. And his parable is this: everyone is living in a cave. And while everyone is living in a cave, they're stuck in the cave because they're looking at the wall in a cave where shadows are passing by every day, and they are entertained by the shadows. And none of them think of leaving the cave. In fact, they don't even think they're in a cave. They think this is life, this is the world, and they sit there and they're looking at the shadows. They're thinking this is all there is to life, nothing else to be discovered in life. The shadows is the most important thing, and they sit there watching the shadows day and night. And Plato says that they're stuck there because of the shadows. And the very first person to ask the question, what are shadows, is the very first philosopher. That person said, how did shadows get here? And he began to look behind. And when he looked behind, he sees light. When he sees light, what does he do? He follows the light. And when he follows the light, he doesn't know where it's leading, but he's determined to know what's out there. If there's light, there's shadows, he asks the question, what brought us here? And so he crawls out, and lo and behold, when he follows the light, he comes out of the cave, and when he emerges out of the cave, he says, wait a minute. There's outside the cave? And then he said, so people are stuck in the cave looking at shadows, and they don't know that these shadows are coming from the outside? And one of the shadows is a rabbit. When this guy gets outside the cave, he looks at a real rabbit and he says, that's a real rabbit. What we're looking at in the cave is just the shadow of a rabbit. But this is what a real rabbit looks like. And then there's a deer on the cave, and this guy says, so we thought we were looking at deers. This is what a deer looks like, because he's looking at it outside the cave. So now he's like so mind-blowing. And he says, this is truth. But then he looks to the sun, and he couldn't see the sun properly because it's so strong. Truth, sometimes you can't receive it all sometimes, and you find it hard to see. But you don't have to believe that there's a sun up there because the sun exists. There's light. Now you can see everything else. You don't have to see the sun directly to believe that it exists, but because of the light of the sun, you believe it exists. You know what C.S. Lewis said about that? C.S. Lewis says, I believe in the sun not because I can see it directly, but because by it I can see everything else. Same idea. So what does this guy do who's just discovered all this truth? What does he do? Well, he wants to tell people. Which people? Well, the ones in the cave. He wants them to be free from the cave, from being stuck on shadows. So Plato says that this guy goes in there and he tells them what happens to that guy that tells the truth to everybody that's in there. What happens to everybody? Well, for starters, nobody believed him. Guys, you're looking at shadows. You need to turn around. You need to come out. No one has ever turned around but him. No one has ever been outside of the cave but him. And he's like, turn around, look. And what happens to him? Gets killed. Now, who was Plato talking about? Who was he talking about when he told that story? No, John the Baptist wasn't even around at the time, but these ideas, right, of people telling the truth and getting killed will continue throughout the centuries. But no one understands that Plato talked about this before Christianity came. That's why a lot of people called him proto-Christian. That's why a lot of people used his writings to teach the Christian worldview, but some people went off the edge, taking more than they should have. So here is what Plato does, right? He's actually talking about his teacher Socrates, and Socrates, he was a soldier in the Persian Wars, and Socrates saw no glory. He saw no glory in war, which is kind of funny because in his culture, war is glorious. Who made it glorious though? The poets made it glorious. Socrates went to war and he saw war and he says, anyone that glories in war doesn't know war. He saw nothing glorious about it. In fact, he saved a friend of his, Blessidus. When he saves a Blessidus, he gets a reward for it, and he says, I don't need it. Don't give me an honor, a badge of honor. I'm just happy he's alive. Socrates believed that we have to be virtuous. We have to live life well, but how do you live life well? Who can tell us, even when you use the word ought, you ought to live a certain way. Who gives you that authority? And so Socrates is asking a very important question. But what was the problem with Socrates asking the question, who gives you that authority? He says it in a time when Greece was moving from an oligarchy system, which was ruled by tyrants, to embracing democracy, and they saw Socrates as a threat to democracy. And here's the truth, like Socrates did see democracy as a threat. Now, why do you think Socrates saw democracy as a threat? Well, the questioning of people is the good part. It's the idea of group mentality. He was concerned about statistics and data. When you talk about statistics, which is, by the way, empirical, just because 10 people agree on something doesn't mean it's right. Well, that's what they were heading towards a time where they said it's what the majority thinks. And Socrates was saying that if it's what the majority thinks, then we're in big trouble because 1 + 1 will no longer equal 2. It's 1 + 1, whatever the majority says. It's like what Churchill said. Churchill said, democracy is a terrible form of governance, but it's better than the alternative. So Socrates said, we need to discover what this word means, and the word is virtue. The discovery of America, or when the government of America was being established, the founding fathers said, this here is super important. Now, if you were here in last week's class, we talked about the differences between the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And there are differences between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The French Revolution says, I'm done with tradition, I'm done with the institution, it's all got to go. The American Revolution was, how can we re-look at these institutions? What does it mean to believe? What does it mean to be virtuous? Listen, Solomon is right. There are no new ideas. There are no new ideas. They were struggling with this in the time when Greece was being established. What do you mean by virtue? And so Socrates says, the unexamined life is not worth living. He says every man ought to examine themselves. Sounds like Paul, right? Every man has to examine themselves. And so when we examine, what does Socrates do? He pulls away from trying to discover truth empirically or rationally in nature, and he turns it on the human being and says, well, don't worry about the cosmos. Let's worry about how to live with each other. I've seen war. And so when Socrates discussed that, they killed him. Now, they gave him an opportunity to run. They said, Socrates, you can escape, you can run. And Socrates says, if I run, then what am I to do with the things that I taught? I can't run. Here I stand. And Plato takes his teachers' teachings, and Plato would go on to teach it, and ended this crisis between the two when he said, listen, it's not empirical or rational, it's both. But he has a natural leaning towards the rational, because Plato says, yes, it's important, our senses are important, but not more important than the ideas. For example, if you were to go and look at a painting at Gerald's house, Gerald has a lot of paintings. If you were to go look at some of those paintings and sit there, and I was to say to you, which one of these paintings is the most beautiful? Plato would say, you don't have, Plato says, you can't have an opinion about what is beautiful unless something called beauty actually exists in another world. You couldn't say it was wrong to kill unless there was some standard of righteousness. You couldn't, like, isn't it funny when you're with some atheist sometimes, and some atheist says, I don't need to go to church to know that it's wrong to lie. Well, then how do you ground those morals? Where do you ground them? It's innate. What does it mean when something's innate? Innate. In nativity. It's born. I'm born with it. How are you born with these things? Plato says you're not born with these things. These things belong to another world. And so everyone said, Plato, you answered the question for us. You solved our problem. Thank you, Plato. Now we can look at our senses, but lean more to this world that's out there, where he says, set not your mind on things of this world, but set them in things above. Now, who said that in our Bibles? Paul. Now, why is Paul using language, even quoting poets and thinkers from Greece? This is an evangelistic question. Why is he doing that? I heard I was preaching one day in Australia, and a lady came up to me after class, and she says, Rome, you need to stop using philosophers, they're pagan. I said, well, then why did John and Paul do it? Why did John use logos, came from Heraclides? Why did Paul quote from the poets, Epimenides, when he talked in Acts chapter 17? There's an evangelistic element to that. And this is the reason that you and I study it in apologetics. It's because it's the world that we live in. Now, I said this earlier, but not much of you were here when I said this. If William the Conqueror was to rise from his grave today, the very first king of England, and he spoke English with Harold, he would not understand half of the things that Harold is speaking about. Have you read some of the writings of these Old English? It's a whole different language, because English today has morphed with Latin and Greek. Now, why do we have Greek in our language? Because it's hard to separate our worldview from that which shaped it. It shaped it even to the point where wherever English is spoken, they will also have Greek thinking, Greek influence, right? Even, it's be crazy when you go to heaven and you say, you know what, apostles, we had it hard because we had to understand these Greeks. You know what they'll say to you? We did too. We had to learn their language. As a matter of fact, in case you didn't know, the original Bible was not written in King James. It's written in Greek. And so we have to tangle with the Greeks. And so just when you thought Plato had solved all the problems that we could run into, he has a student, and his student's name is Aristotle. And Aristotle says, well, Plato, you're right, but you lean too much to the rational. I think you need to lean more to the empirical, to the senses. And Plato says, well, what do you mean by that? Don't you think that the important things are in the ideal world? And no one understand, I'm generalizing this because of our time and because of, I'm generalizing some deep ideas and actually look at and study and see if it's real. That created a lot of problems. Because now we've got Aristotle who challenges Plato. And what happens when two ideas sound correct? What happened in history when the Ionians and the Italians challenged each other and they both sound right? What comes up? Skepticism. Two ideas sound the same. When two ideas sound the same. And what are they trying to solve? The meaning of life. Metaphysical questions, the ought questions, and then skepticism produces these ideas that says, who cares? I don't care. You ever hear your kids say, I don't care? Do you know about the Beatitudes of Jesus? I don't care. They won't say it to you, but how is that important? How am I going to pay my bills with the Beatitudes of Jesus? It's like no longer the deep, meaningful. Skepticism comes out of this philosophical impasse where two ideas can't solve their problems. And so who comes along and solves the problem of Plato and Aristotle? There's a famous painting by Raphael, and the painting has on one side all the rationalists. You have all the rationalists on one side, all the rational thinkers on one side. Parmenides, Zeno, all on one side. On the other side, you've got all the empiricists in this painting. Like Raphael, you go look at it. It's the School of Athens is the name of the painting. And at the front of all these philosophers is you've got Plato, and he's doing this. What's he saying? All our answers and the most important things are where? Up there. And then you've got Aristotle on the other end, and he's doing this. What's he saying? Most important things are where? Down here. And he's got 5 fingers out. Oh, my daughter would correct me. 4 fingers, 1 thumb, out there. And it's all 5 are pointing down saying, it's about the senses. It's about rationalism. Senses, rationalism. Who solves this puzzle? Who solves it? Christianity. Christianity comes along. The School of Athens, if you want to see that picture. But Christianity comes along and they said, hey, we're going to deal with this. We're going to deal with this problem of empiricism and rationalism. Now, let me ask you a question. How does Christianity deal with empiricism and rationalism? How does Christianity do that? Jesus. Now, how does Jesus answer? Remember, Plato says the most important things are up there. Now, he called it the ideal world. I mean, he's before Christianity. Aristotle says, can you bring anything from up there down here so we can touch it, feel it? Who came from up there down here and we touched him, we beheld him, we walked with him? Who came? Jesus. Jesus comes into the picture, and when Jesus comes into the picture, no one understands he will never leave the picture. No matter how atheistic the worldview is, no matter how atheistic the thinker is, that's why you and I have been looking at all the major philosophers in history, looking at guys like Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, Empedocles. All these guys would lay the ground from when Jesus comes, he ain't going nowhere. Jesus is not going anywhere. No matter how John Locke, Gottfried Leibniz, you've got David Hume, then you've got like Spinoza, Descartes. They tried their best. How can we establish truth without this guy? You can't. It's called the Christian synthesis. Christianity answers to these 2 sides. So, empiricism doesn't go anywhere. Rationalism doesn't go anywhere. Augustine, remember when we studied Augustine? Augustine, he's like the OG, the original gangster when we talk about theology, both for the Catholics and the Protestants. Both look at Augustine and say, Augustine has the greatest mind who invented theology. Whose ideas did he borrow? To tell whose tools did he use to teach Christianity? Plato. That's why some people say Augustine is just another Platonic. He's just a Platonist, that's all he is. And no one understands that if you ever preach a sermon and use anything Augustine, you could get accused of being a Platonist. But then you got like Augustine's ideas, the church. The church leans to rationalism because they say faith will lead you to reason. Faith will lead you to reason. And the church conquered for thousands of years thinking that way. That's how. Anselm, guys. Anselm of Canterbury, who came up with his ontological arguments. And his ontological argument is in the tradition of rationalism. And then another religion comes up, and this other religion begins to challenge Christianity. And how did they challenge Christianity? Well, they came across some writings of some ancient Greeks. And they wrote the very first book on human biology. They wrote the very first book on mathematics. Who was it? Islam. Islam comes around, and Islam begins to challenge Christianity. Now, who does Islam borrow when they challenge Christianity? Aristotle. They call it the Aristotelian argument and the Platonist argument. Now, how many of you have seen a cathedral, a medieval cathedral? You look at those pictures and you stand at the bottom and they're sharp, right? Those Gothic looking churches. It's making you look where? Up. Now, how did the Muslims do their buildings? Was it round? Going where? Going Aristotelian. The church, the Catholic Church, they said, well, we're getting defeated by these Aristotelians. How do we combat these Aristotelians? And Thomas Aquinas says, by being Aristotelian. And so Thomas Aquinas borrows the Aristotelian argument. Now if you look at the buildings in Rome today, do they go up? Or are they Aristotelian? They're round. Even here in America, see these buildings with the pillars, but they're round. It's Eastern influence, by the way. So you have Christianity that are now dominant, but Christianity couldn't get themselves together because what happens is you have a divide in Christianity, and that divide is called the Reformation. The Reformation devastated the church. It divided the church like nothing else did before it. It divided the church over doctrine, method, reasoning. It divided the church. And Martin Luther, who nailed the 95 Theses on the door, things would never be the same after it. And so you have Christianity now that's divided. What happens when two ideas clash? Skepticism. Skepticism, wars. And more wars, the 30 Years' War. The founding of America is the result of the same battle between Christianity and within Christianity, because Jesus is not going anywhere, but our interpretation of Jesus and our teachings of Jesus becomes a problem. And so when they were divided, we went into an era known as the era of uncertainty. It's the era of uncertainty. Why? It's the era of uncertainty because the age of faith has collapsed. The age of faith didn't get it right. French Revolution, the de-Christianization of Europe, we're done with this. The American Revolution, well, we have to be very careful on how we establish this government. We don't want any sort of ideas that would challenge us. And so these ideas, right? These ideas of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, what drove those ideas? What were the driving forces behind these ideas? The French Revolution, you've got ideas that came out of France, and ideas that came out of Britain. Out of France came Descartes. Out of Britain came Locke. You remove Locke, you remove the founding fathers' documents. Most of it is influenced by Locke, John Locke. And so Locke is important. See, ideas are so important, but we don't know where these ideas came from. If you study the people and the ideas, you know how to deal with them. That's why we studied them in these last few weeks. We looked at Locke, we looked at Descartes. What did Locke and Descartes do? Well, they did exactly the same thing they did in Greece thousands of years ago. They went back to rationalism and empiricism, And Descartes says, there must be no God. It has to be deeply rational. I can't trust my senses anymore. I have to doubt. I doubt that Harold is sitting there. I doubt that I'm standing in a church. I doubt that there's a clock in front of me. I doubt that I got 10 more minutes. I doubt that there's a Christmas program. I doubt that Jesus existed. I doubt until he realized, after going through all the doubts, that Descartes realized, well, I can't actually doubt that I'm doubting. So I know one thing is true. I'm thinking. And if I'm thinking, therefore I exist. Cognito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. That idea came. Locke would challenge that idea. Locke would bring it back to experience again. And so again, we find ourselves in this situation where empiricism, rationalism are facing each other. Skepticism comes about again. French Revolution, American Revolution. That's the class last week. They can't get it together. We can't establish a Christian theocracy. We have to learn from where we came from. So Thomas Jefferson said there has to be a separation between church and state. But one has to define what separation of church and state is before you talk about separation of church and state. Because what people think today is separation of church and state is, church, get out of here. State remains where it is. Instead of thinking of like the way that Thomas Jefferson would have thought about it, is what distinguishes church. What is the role of the church and what is the role of the state? Stay in your lane. Like Jesus says, render to Caesar what is Caesar, and render to God what is God. In just one statement, separation of church and state. One statement. Separation of church and state. So you get this French Revolution, an American Revolution, and out of this chaos of trying to discover whether it's empirical or rational, our guy Immanuel Kant comes around. Okay, now you're all caught up. We did 34 classes in 40 minutes. Immanuel Kant is going to step in and say, things need to change. And here's the thing about Immanuel Kant. He never left his home of Königsberg. He never left his home. He woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning, studied for 3 hours, went to university and taught for 4 hours. Then he will go to the exact same restaurant at the exact same time and have lunch there. Then he'll go for a walk. After walking, he'll do some reading. After some reading, he'll sleep at the exact same time every day. Immanuel Kant had a strict life because he believed that if we were disciplined, that our thinking would be a lot clearer. And there was a joke, and I don't know if this is true, but they'll tell these stories. They said people would set their clocks based on Immanuel Kant. Wherever he was, they knew where he would be. When he'd go for a walk, it's 5 o'clock in the morning. If he's having lunch, it's exactly 12. Immanuel Kant will never turn up to a meeting late, nor will he walk away from that meeting until the time hits. Like everything is structured when it came to him. And yet Immanuel Kant's ideas transformed theology, transformed philosophy, transformed apologetics forever. And this is why I wanted to pause today and do a bit of review before we get into this beast, Immanuel Kant. Because he's super important in how we do things, because they call it, when Immanuel Kant comes to the scene, he calls his movement the Copernican revolution of philosophy. Anyone know anything about the Copernican revolution in the scientific community? For a long time, everybody had accepted this idea of the earth being at the center. Geocentrism was at the center. Ptolemy came up with that. Aristotle taught that. Until Copernicus, without any instruments, said that no. Our earth is not the center. The sun is at the center. Well, what's the Immanuel Kant revolution in philosophy? He says it's not your senses. It's not even in rationalism. Where is it? He says, stop, look, you got your phones, right? Stop looking for truth through your phone. Push that button that says to flip the camera on you. He's the very first person to say, flip it on your mind. He says everything that you and I experience in life, whether it's empiricism or rationalism, at the end of the day, it's your mind that's processing these thoughts. And so in the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at his categorical imperatives. We're going to be looking at his idea of the sausage grinder. Trust the Germans to come up with that as a theory, a sausage grinder. It's some amazing ideas. But he says you can't study God. You cannot study God because finite cannot study the infinite. Finite cannot study infinite. And because of Immanuel Kant, they remove theology from the sciences and said it's religious studies. Because you can't study God. Theology is the study of God. Religion is the study of man. And you can only study God through how man perceives him. So, I leave us there. Next week, we are going to unpack this giant, Immanuel Kant. But at the end of discussing Immanuel Kant, I'm going to give you 4 things that I disagree with him on that would help us also to kind of look and tangle with this mind. Let's pray. Thank you so much for being here. Lord, thank you for this class, and I thank you for those who are here and those who are tuning in. And I pray, Lord, that you will continue to challenge our thinking and help us, Father, to grow our toolbox, our evangelistic toolbox, Lord. Not so that we can be aggressive in our argumentation with people, but that we may be able to reveal Jesus, Lord. That people may be attracted to Jesus, Lord. And that we are able to speak their language the way that Paul was able to speak their language and lead them to Jesus. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.